cardigan. Could you help Gisa choose a cardigan? Choose one that Mummy made.
Come on round, said Richard Ratcliffe. The house is a tip, but frankly, today, who cares? Anxious, it isn't over till it's over, till she's in the plane and out of Iranian airspace.
I know that she is now at the airport in Tehran, so she is awaiting a flight. We also know that the government is getting ready to make a briefing in a couple of hours' time, which presumably is to say she's on a flight, she's left Iranian airspace. So it feels really close.
Close but not there. 7-year-old Gabriella, who's scarcely seen her mother, packing up to go to a safe house for the family to be reunited properly after 6 long, hard, bleak years.
Been no hiccups so far. Feels really close. And then for Gabriella, you can hear her singing, playing the piano, just excited, and she was, talking through with which of her soft toys she should take and which ones knew Mummy and which ones didn't know Mummy, and whether she'd take one that would be a nice surprise.
A tweet from the Foreign Secretary appeared to confirm positive news, and then, suddenly, a text at last for Richard Ratcliffe from Nazanin. She's on the plane. She's sent a selfie. It's happening.
So, things moving forwards. That's just a picture of Nazanin having got on the plane. This is now her on the plane, looking pretty excited. Not taken off yet, but yeah, it's obviously pretty close.
But he said it won't be real until I see her. Mohammed, Nazanin's brother, who brought Gabriella to Britain, busying himself with the kitchen cleanup. But then the texts, the congratulations rolled in.
6 years, Sorry.
What do you mean sorry? Sorry for what? So? Stop!
Global confirmation from Iranian TV, brief footage of her in Tehran and boarding a chartered jet. At Muscat, a stopover. She's due to land back in the UK around 10:30 tonight. Yes, it's all been about tanks and debt and nuclear threats. But today of all days, it's about 3 families, 3 hostages. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anoosheh Ashoori, both released today and coming home. And Morad Tabaz, partially set free. All pawns of politics. Freed for many reasons, not least the payment of money the UK has owed Iran for more than 40 years.
I pushed officials to be as creative as possible in finding a way to resolve this situation, and they have worked round the clock to find a viable payment route.
The look of utter shock. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was arrested at Tehran airport by Iranian Revolutionary Guards, then aged 37. Held in solitary confinement, she was then given a 5-year sentence for alleged spying. All the while, her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, family and supporters started a long publicity campaign to keep her case alive, despairing at the Foreign Office approach. There was a serious blunder by the then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson in Parliament when he appeared to give support to Iran's false claims about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe.
She was simply teaching people journalism, as I understand it.
Next year, as campaigning at home continued relentlessly, she was temporarily released from jail and hopes soared. But 3 days later, after meeting her daughter, she was back inside. By the following summer, both Nazanin and her husband were back on hunger strikes, pleading with the now Prime Minister Boris Johnson to put right his previous blunder, and he began pressing for her release. The following spring, as the pandemic took hold, she was released again under virtual house arrest. Spring 2021, another agonizing twist. She was given a further year in jail. Back in the UK, Richard Ratcliffe began another hunger strike, calling on the government to do more. He ended it after 21 days without food. Today's dramatic moves to freedom come just a day after her passports were returned. Anoosheh Ashoori, a second dual nationality hostage, also released today as part of this deal. He got 10 years from the Iranian authorities. But it still leaves the only British-born hostage, Morad Tabaz, still under house arrest in Tehran. Iran's preparing for New Year, traditionally a time to show mercy. But 8 other hostages were arrested along with Morad Tabaz, and hostages from several other Western countries still languish in Iranian prisons. But in London today, a moment for Gabriella Zaghari-Ratcliffe to bounce around the kitchen, try on a new dress, practice a tune for the mum she has barely seen.
Daddy, was that good?
That's really good, isn't it?
Well, much of that exclusive footage was filmed by Darius Bazargan. Before we came on air, I spoke to Anoosheh Ashoori's daughter, Elika, and I asked her how she's feeling, knowing her father is finally on his way home.
I'm mainly thinking about him and, how he would be feeling, because he has spent the last 5 years inside a damp, dirty prison cell and, not seeing the light of day, not sleeping in a comfortable bed, sleeping with bed bugs and not eating good food. So the only thing we're going to focus on now is to bring him home, get him to sleep in his bed and get him to eat good food and be surrounded by us.
And it's been 5 long years since his arrest. What have you missed during that time? What have you missed about him? What have you missed doing together as a family?
Oh, everything. I mean, you have the general things like birthdays, Christmases, Iranian New Year's coming on, in a week or less than a week. And, it's just a piece of puzzle that's been missing without him being here. I bought a house just before he was detained that he's never seen. So life has moved on for half a decade. It's like he's been in a time warp.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder how frustrating it's been for you getting his plight to public attention, standing up to the Foreign Office, which didn't want you to go public, and then, of course, this issue of the debt. If that had been paid years ago, your dad might have been freed. And, if Boris Johnson hadn't mistakenly referred to Nazanin, training journalists, again, it might have been unblocked. How angry are you about that?
Yeah, very. I mean, you can't imagine how many nights we've wondered why this debt wasn't being paid, and why was it that there's only attention and focus on it now with the current geopolitical situation in the world, whereas before it was just about 2 or 3 individuals and we didn't really matter. But it is very frustrating. It should have been done a long time ago, and not just to prevent Nazanin and my dad being taken, but the people who have been subsequently taken after my dad who are still there. So, this could have all been prevented.
Well, what will you do as a family in the next few days? What's the first thing you want to do with your dad?
Well, we're planning on giving him an ice cold beer because he hasn't had one in 5 years. So, yeah, that's the first thing. A very good dinner, and probably just hanging out with our dogs that I think he misses the dogs a lot, as well as he's missing us. And just doing normal family things, just the things that you do, and catch up without any filters or barriers of, phone calls or jail cells.
And you've made a cake for him.
Yes, I am a baker, and I have made a small cake because this was very sudden, but I have made a cake for him, and I am planning to make a very elaborate cake for him for his birthday, which is coming up in 3 weeks.
And you've also had contact with Gabriella, haven't you, Nazanin's daughter? Tell us how you struck up a rapport with her.
Oh, I absolutely adore Gabriella. We have, despite our age difference, we bond really well. I mean, whenever there is an event that Richard does or we do, we always, the first thing I say and the first thing Gabriella says when we go there is she here? So I think we have bonded in a very unique way that no other 2 daughters could have, because we have had something taken from us that no one really could understand what it feels like unless you're in that situation.
Elika Ashoori, thank you so much, and so pleased for you that you're going to be reunited within hours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, of course, the release of Nazanin and Anoosheh comes against a background of a bigger diplomatic game driven by world events. As Russia's war forces the West to look elsewhere for its oil and gas, there is renewed focus on restoring friendlier relations with Iran. And today, Boris Johnson was visiting Saudi Arabia in the hopes of securing alternative supplies of energy, despite serious concerns over human rights there. Our economics correspondent Helia Abrahimi reports.
The 1,500 Chieftain tanks promised, but never delivered, as Britain salivated over the weapons gold rush it could cash in on.
The scope and potential for British arms exports here is extraordinary.
Britain was paid £400 million, but the tanks never arrived in Iran as the country slipped into revolution. Today, more than 40 years later, Britain has settled the bill, conceding it was always a legitimate debt. It's this Russian assault on Ukraine that has moved the dial on global oil diplomacy, with the UK and US banning Russian energy and Europe pledging to turn its back on its #1 gas provider as quickly as it can. But the realpolitik of lights going out and petrol pumps running dry in Western cities and towns is creating a new set of uncomfortable alliances.
At the moment, we're making decisions that I imagine leaders in the Western world would rather they didn't make. But fundamentally, this is about defeating Vladimir Putin's war. Now, there is a bigger issue in all of this, of course, which is that Western countries haven't really had a genuine energy strategy for a very great many years. Western countries like the UK, like the EU, are indeed hostages to the providers of those hydrocarbons. At the moment, we're trying to decide whose hostage would we rather be.
The UK government talked about today's payment as being sorted in parallel with Nazanin and Anoosheh's release. Now focus will turn to Iran's nuclear deal, for a decade a major cause of escalating tensions in the Middle East. Sanctions on Iran started in 1979 after the capture of the US embassy in Tehran. By 2012, it was focused on curbing the country's nuclear ambitions, freezing central bank assets and banning oil imports. In 2015, the Obama administration signed the Iranian nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But within 4 years, Donald Trump had withdrawn US support and ratcheted up curbs, leaving more than $100 billion of bank assets frozen. By last year, in retaliation, Iran had enriched uranium at levels just below what's needed for a nuclear bomb.
If Iran believes that now it's in a position that it can extract concessions that were not on the books before the Ukraine crisis, I think that's one of the miscalculations that might result in the collapse of the agreement. So now is the time to finalize this agreement. Otherwise, it's an opportunity that would be lost. And then the world has to deal, in addition with the crisis in Ukraine, with a nuclear crisis in the Middle East in the coming weeks. And that's not in the interest of anyone.
Watching that deal will be Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who the Prime Minister went to woo today. The music may be playing for Johnson, but the Saudi response to pleas from Washington for more oil has been conspicuous silence. Despite today's sweep of signed documents, MBS has said he no longer cares about the judgment of the West and would be happy to turn to China for closer economic ties. If they wanted, Saudi and the UAE could add 1.8 million barrels of oil quite easily to the market. Iran, a sleeping powerhouse, could produce 1 million barrels, while another former US pariah, Venezuela, is said to be talking about committing 600,000 barrels to the global market. The energy crisis created by trying to isolate the world's 11th biggest economy is lending luster to countries who have been out in the cold, with new lines drawn about who is and who isn't morally acceptable for Western trade.
Well, there were 5 foreign secretaries during the years that Nazanin was unable to leave Iran. One of them was Jeremy Hunt. When I spoke to him earlier, I began by asking if this could have been resolved years earlier.
When I was Foreign Secretary, I looked at the issue very carefully, and I concluded that this was not a ransom. This was money that we owed Iran legally. An international court had decided that. And if we're going to say that around the world countries need to obey the rule of law, then we too have to settle our debts, however unsavoury the regime is that we owe that money to.
So how did Liz Truss find a way where you didn't?
Liz Truss herself told the Commons this afternoon that the change in government in Iran meant that it was possible to have a fresh start on all these negotiations. And I think we had to go on a journey too to say, yes, we're going to pay this money. And then we had to put in the work to find out how we could do that in a way that was consistent with the sanctions that are currently in place against Iran.
But, you know, you paid tribute to Boris Johnson, amongst others, but he set this back, didn't he, by making that mistake over, you know, saying that Nazanin was teaching journalists.
Well, I don't think when I was Foreign Secretary the Iranians were telling me it was that. What they were telling me was this all hinges on the debt. And if you pay the debt, we'll let Nazanin out. And so that was where we focused our energy. I think they used those comments to try and embarrass Boris Johnson.
Is there a sense that this is bound up not only with the debt, but with the nuclear deal? And in particular, you know, we want to get our hands now on Iranian oil all of a sudden.
I don't think so. I think the reality is that we need the Saudis to help us, and that's why the Prime Minister's in Saudi to deal with that side of things. But I think what Putin has done in Ukraine has reminded us that it is really important that irresponsible powers are not nuclear armed. And that's why signing a nuclear deal with Iran matters to all of us. I think the situation in the Middle East is complex and dangerous enough without having another nuclear power there. My worry was in the last few weeks that that issue and all those talks in Vienna could also get muddled in with the Nazanin issue. And so what's fantastic about tonight's news is that we've extracted Nazanin. She should never have been a diplomatic pawn. It was a terrible thing for Iran to do. I think we'll also conclude we took too long to work out a way through it. But for today, a good thing, a really wonderful thing has happened for 3 families.
When you look at Boris Johnson rubbing shoulders with people who have authorised a load of executions just days ago, doesn't it make you feel sick to the pit of your stomach?
I think it makes all of us feel very uncomfortable. But the reality is, if you want to be a force in the world for good, and Britain, we're not a superpower, but we are still a global power, then when you're tackling problems like climate change, problems like the invasion of Ukraine, you have to talk to everyone, including regimes with really horrible records on human rights, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran, because that is diplomacy, and you can't solve these problems unless you get everyone round the table. So, you know, the question is, how do you square that circle? That's why, of course, we have diplomats to help us do it. My own view is you talk to these people, but you always mention your concerns on human rights. You have to do it if you want to get out there in the world and try and solve some of these problems.
Just finally, we have this exclusive footage tonight of Richard-Ratcliffe with his family preparing for Nazanin's return, his devotion to their little girl, Gabriella. Have you found that completely inspirational, as so many have?
It chokes me up, actually. I mean, he's someone who is humble, but so determined. I think he was the bravest person I met when I was Foreign Secretary.
Jeremy Hunt, thank you very much for joining us.